Hi, and welcome to my NGUI tutorial. In this tutorial, we'll be using the free version of NGUI. This is a little older and has fewer features, but it's rich enough for us to build some basic user interfaces. For today's tutorial, we'll be building out the following concept. So what you have here is a background, and on top of that background you have the skyline, which is a separate image. You have options to start the game or quit it, and then you have a progress bar that will emulate, a sort of a load. A very typical menu screen for a lot of games that you might have played. Everything you see here is an image. In NGUI, we'll call these images sprites. I have all these images lying in my file directory over here. So this was the fill of the progress bar. This was the frame that encapsulated that fill. This was the quit sprite when it's highlighted. This is what that quit sprite looks like when it's not highlighted. Similarly, two sprites for play. You have a sprite for the skyline and a sprite for the background. So in order to use these images in my UI, I first have to create a UI atlas using these sprites. So what is a UI atlas? A UI atlas is basically a mashup of all the sprites or images being used to render the UI. Currently, all these images would be loaded as individual textures, but it is more efficient to mash them up together into a single large file for the purpose of rendering to the UI. So let's go ahead and import these into our project. Great. And let's go ahead and get started by creating a UI atlas. So what I'm going to do here is select all these images, or at least the ones that I think I want to use in my UI, and click the NGUI menu and click Open the Atlas Maker. So this pops up a dialog, and you can see that it has already loaded the textures that I want to add to this UI atlas. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a name. And I'm going to hit create. Cool. So let's take a look at what the Atlas Maker has created for us. So if you remember, I told you the atlas was a giant texture which was a mashup of all the other textures that we add into the atlas. So let's take a look at what that looks like in the preview pane. So as you can see, I have my background sprite, I have the skyline, I have the individual sprites for the play and quit options, as well as for the progress bar. So this is one giant texture, and NGUI will just simply use this to render the individual sprites as and when needed. Great. Now that we've created our atlas, it's time to start building our UI. The first step is to create a root container. This is the container that will hold everything inside our UI. So let's go ahead and do that by clicking the NGUI menu and clicking UI Wizard. So this is the UI Wizard, and it basically has very few options. It asks you for a layer name, and for now let's just go with UI. And it asks you for a camera that you would like to use in this UI. So yeah, for now we are creating a simple two-dimensional UI. You have other options that allow you to create, more advanced 3D UI. But for now, let's just go ahead and use these settings. So you can see that by doing that, the UI tool has added a few objects to the hierarchy. Let's take a look at what these are. Let's start with the outermost object. This is the UI root. This will contain our UI. The UI root is put in place essentially to manage the scaling of the UI and ensure that it fits well on the screen. You may also notice that a layer name has been put for this UI root for us. So currently the layer name is UI, and I'll get to explaining why this is important in just a second. The next thing you'll notice is that this UI root has its own camera. If you look at the culling mask of this camera, you will notice that it shares the same layer name as the UI root. So basically what this tells me is that this camera will only draw elements that are on the UI layer and nothing else. So this camera is dedicated exclusively to rendering the UI. Finally, let's check out the panel object. The panel object has a script attached to it called UI panel. This panel allows us to anchor individual components of our UI to different parts of the screen. We'll be looking at this in more detail in just a second. For now, it's important to understand that this particular panel, like UI root, spans over the entire screen, and we'll be using this to anchor different parts of our UI onto the screen. Alright, I think it's time that we started laying out the UI. Let's start out with the background, and what we need to do is create a new sprite. So I'll click the NGUI menu and I'll click create a sprite. Now what this has done is it's arbitrarily picked some sprite. As you can see, this is not the background sprite. This is in fact the fill of the progress bar that we're hoping to use. And it's added the sprite to the panel of our UI. So first things first, let's change this to the sprite that we really want to use. So I clicked the sprite option over here, and it brings up a viewer that allows me to look at all the sprites that are in the atlas. Now, if there were textures that you didn't add into the atlas, they will not be displayed here. So let's go ahead and click the background sprite, and I think it's already set. As you can see, it has changed, but currently the sprite is not properly scaled. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and start changing that to reflect the original scale. So I can see that over here in the preview pane, the size of the sprite is 1680 by 1050. So let's go ahead and put that in the scale. Alright, so this is now spanning over the entire screen. In fact, it's actually going further beyond the entire screen. So perhaps I could scale it down just a little, maintaining its aspect ratio. Okay, so that's just about fitting the bounds of our UI root. As you can see, this purple line here denotes the bounds of the screen and denotes the bounds of the UI root. So it's a little over on the vertical edges, but that's fine. Let's take a look at what this looks like in the game window. So in the game window, you can see that we have the nice gradient that we wanted for our background. Cool. Let's get back to building the rest of our UI. So I've put my sprite in place, scaled it up, but what I really want to do is make sure that this sprite stays anchored, stays in place, and stays attached to the screen and to the panel object. So what I'm going to do now is basically anchor this sprite to this panel object over here. So let's go ahead and do that. And the way to do that is by attaching an anchor. And again, we'll go to the NGUI menu and attach an anchor. So now you can see that a UI anchor script has been attached to the sprite. And let's take a moment to explore what are the options that the script needs. So it already tells us that, okay, the camera is already attached for us. If you look at that, it needs a UI widget. For this case, we don't have one. And then it has a panel container. So what I'm going to do is simply grab this and drag it onto my panel container option for the script. So now I've indicated that this anchor is in fact attached to this panel container, and I want to now understand how is this anchored. Is it anchored to the center of this panel? Is it anchored to the top left or just the left edge? There are different uses for all of these, and we'll get into exploring each of those in just a second. But for now, I want this to span over my entire screen, and I really want this to kind of flow out from the center. So I'll leave this option as the center, and just like that, I've now attached my background sprite to the panel using an anchor. Let me go ahead and change the name of this sprite. Great. Alright, let's go ahead and add the other sprites that will make up this UI. So I'm going to select my panel. Since all these sprites are going to be anchored or attached to the panel, I'm going to click NGUI, again, create a sprite, and that's going to add another sprite to my UI. So this time I'm going to create the skyline. So again, this is not the sprite we want, so we're going to click sprite, and we're going to choose the skyline. And you can see, again, the scale is a bit off, so I'm going to go ahead and manually enter the scale over here. In the preview pane, you can see that these are the actual dimensions, so I'm going to stick to that. So of course, this is a little larger than we want, so we can uniformly scale it down so that it fits the bounds of our UI root. Perfect. Now again, I want this to be anchored to this panel. Right now it's just floating out there. So what I'm going to do is add an anchor by going to the NGUI menu. So now I have my anchor script. Let's tell the script where the panel for this UI is. That's good. But if you look at our concept, what I really want is the skyline to be at the bottom, flush to the bottom edge of the screen. And right now, if you look at the game window, it's kind of floating somewhere around the middle. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and select the bottom edge, and voila, you can see that the sprite has been kind of attached. If you look at the purple line over here, that goes right through the middle of the sprite. So the center of the sprite is attached to the bottom edge of the UI root. Let's take a look at what this looks like in the game window. Okay, so not quite the results that we were hoping for. So let's go ahead and adjust the relative offset along the y-axis. Okay, so by adjusting the relative offset along the y-axis, I can control the offset from that edge and still have this anchored to that bottom edge. So it looks like we've overdone it just a little bit, and let's lower it back down. Okay, I think that looks pretty clear. Good. Let's rename the sprite. Now that we've added a background and the skyline, let's go ahead and add some of the other interactive elements of the UI. So I'm talking about the play and the quit options. Again, we'll select our panel, create a sprite, and the sprite is going to be play. And again, it's not properly scaled, so let's go ahead and change the scale on this. Again, you can find the exact dimensions of that sprite over here at the bottom in your preview pane. Okay, now if you look at a concept UI, the play button or the play action item is kind of flush towards the top edge of the screen. So what I'm going to do is anchor this to the top edge. Okay, and typically its center is kind of attached to the top edge. So let's adjust the vertical offset and bring it down just a little bit. So let's see what this looks like in the game window. Okay, so it is kind of large given the relative size of our window and the other sprites. So let's scale it down just a little bit. That's more like it. Okay, let's rename this and call it action play. And now I want to go ahead and do something similar for the quit action. But I really don't want to go through all the steps given the fact that this is really just going to be very similar to the play sprite. So I'm going to just duplicate the play sprite and I'm going to rename it. And then I'm going to go ahead and tell it to use the quit sprite. So you can see thanks to the duplication, the anchor is already attached. Now all I have to do is adjust the relative offset. And there we have it. So I can see that my quit sprite is a little squished, and this could be a function of how, I've used Photoshop to create these. So I think what we could do is give it a little more probably just a little more. Okay, so that looks pretty good. That looks crisp. And let's go ahead and move it slightly lower. Cool. I'm actually pretty pleased with this. So now that we've gone ahead and added the play and quit sprites, let's go ahead and build out our progress bar. Before we do that, let me explain how the progress bar will be built. We have two sprites or two images for making the progress bar. Let's see what those look like. So here you can see that there is one sprite that will be the container and the other sprite will act as the fill for the progress bar. That's very typical of progress bars you might have seen in the UI that you might have used on Windows, on the Mac, or on the web. The special thing about this is that both these are actually of the same size and they've been laid on top of each other to create that illusion that one contains the other. So let's go ahead and create a sprite. And this one is the fill sprite. So I'm going to go ahead and change it to the container sprite or the frame. I'm going to scale it down just a little bit. And if you look at the UI concept, I actually want this to be kind of in the middle, but really the position of this depends on the position of the play and quit. So I really want it to be flush to the top in this case as well. So I'm going to go ahead and anchor it to the top and adjust the relative offset to make it fall slightly below the quit. So let's see if we can move the three of these, or maybe we can just lower the skyline just a little bit to give it a little more breathing room. Yeah, I think that works. So we've added a sprite for the frame. Let's change its name. We'll call it PG bar frame. And now we have to add a sprite for the fill. And just like we did with the play and quit sprites, where I just duplicated, oh, this actually hasn't been changed. Let's change that to quit. Okay, so just like I did with the play and quit sprites, where I duplicated the play sprite and just modified it, I'm going to do the same with the progress bar. So I've duplicated it. This is going to be the fill. And this is now the fill on the progress bar. So you can see right now it completely covers the frame sprite or the containing sprite. And I don't know how this could actually convince any user that this is actually a progress bar. Because what's characteristic of the progress bar is, you know, the filling up from the left to the right. Now, how do we go about achieving that effect? And NGUI actually, this is where NGUI really shines, because it allows you to control not just the appearance of the sprite through, you know, the transform and the anchor, but it will allow you to change the fill settings of the sprite itself. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. So I have an option called sprite type, which is right now set to the value simple. I'm going to go ahead and change this to a filled sprite. And the moment I do that, I have a few more options that appear. The first one being the fill direction, and currently it's set to radial 360, which I don't know if it makes much sense, but it almost seems like there's going to be something circular going on. But a progress bar really just goes from left to right in the horizontal direction. So that's what we want to go and set this fill direction to horizontal. And now the fill amount is basically a slider which will allow you to control how much the width of this is going, what is the fill, how much of this sprite's area is going to be filled with the actual content of the sprite. So let me see if I can take a closer look. So when I adjust the fill amount, you can see that this actually really starts to look more like the progress bar. And this fill amount can easily be changed using code. So for now, let's leave this to let's say that much to let us know that this is in fact a filled sprite. Okay, cool. Let's see what this looks like in the game window. Yeah, so a lot similar to our concept in Photoshop. So in this manner, what we've done is we've basically finished laying out the UI. And now what's left to do is manipulate the UI based on different interactions that we can program using code. So far, we've laid out our UI elements, anchored them appropriately to the panel, and looked at using simple and filled sprites. But this UI is still static. We need to write some code to make this interactive. Before we start doing that, let's define what the interaction would look like. I have two options here in my game's menu, play and quit. I want the arrow keys to be able to toggle between play and quit. The up arrow key would highlight play, and the down arrow key should highlight the quit button. I also want the progress bar to remain hidden until the enter key is pressed. And when I press the enter key, I want the progress bar to appear and animate or fill up from 0 to 1 over a few seconds. Now typically when you see a progress bar running in a real game, they're doing something in the background or asynchronously loading some content. But for simplicity, we'll just be running the progress bar to make it look cool. Finally, when the progress bar is done loading, I would like to fade this UI by changing its opacity. So let's get started. I'm going to create an empty game object and attach my script to it. Let's call this game object input controller object. And the new script would be called input controller. Okay, so the first objective is toggling between the play and quit buttons using the up and down arrow keys. And let's make these public so that we can see them in the inspector. So now when this is done compiling, I should have two options to set these two sprites for play and quit. Let's go ahead and drag those in, like so. Okay, now I'd like to set the state of each of these sprites. So I'm going to make two methods. And here I'm going to write the code that would highlight the play. And you must understand that while we highlight the play sprite, we want to dim or deselect the quit sprite, and vice versa for the quit sprite. So before we do that, we need to know what the names of the exact sprites from the atlas are so that we can set those appropriately. So if you look at the current name of the current sprite that's currently being displayed here, it's called 0005 underscore play underscore normal. And once it's highlighted, we'd be choosing this sprite, which is 004 underscore play underscore highlight. Now, I'm not going to remember or hard code these names. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the reference to the textures, which also bears the same name. So the atlas was constructed using these textures, and chances are that the name in the atlas is exactly the same as the name of the texture. So let's go ahead and create and similarly, let's go ahead and create textures for the quit sprite. Let's compile that. All right, now let's go ahead and bind our textures to this script. So let's start with a play normal sprite. And now let's do the two sprites for the quit button. Okay, so in this manner, we basically have the names of the different textures that we'd like to use for the sprites. So now we'd like to highlight the play sprite based on the status. So if status, we'd like to change the name, so sprite name, play selected dot name. And we'd also like to change the quit sprite to be deselected. Great. Actually, let's go ahead and write the inverse logic here. I'm just going to copy and paste that code. Okay, let's do the same for the quit sprite. And while the quit is selected, the play sprite needs to be deselected. So let's set that to its normal state. Okay. Now when I want this scene to load, or when this UI should load, I want the play sprite to be selected by default. So I'm just going to go ahead and set that to true. And if you remember, I also mentioned that I want the progress bar to remain hidden. So let's add a reference to our progress bar. Now, if you remember, our progress bar is made up of two sprites, one which is an outer container and one that acts as a fill. Let's go ahead and attach these as well to the script. I'm going to now write a method to change the visibility of the progress bar. So notice how I'm actually calling the setActive method on the game object on which the UI sprite script runs for this particular element. So this is almost as good as going ahead and toggling this checkbox over here. So it's literally going to have the same effect. These two lines are going to have the same effect as toggling the checkbox. And if the status is false, I'd want these to be hidden. Okay, let's go ahead and test out what we've written so far. So I'm going to go ahead and attach my game window back into the Unity, and let's see what this looks like when it runs. So our progress bar is hidden and our play button is selected. That's exactly the result we wanted. Let's continue developing that script. So the interaction has still not been programmed in, and that was toggling between the play and the quit sprites or the highlighted states using the arrow keys. So now I'm going to check for when the user presses the arrow keys. So if the up arrow key is pressed, I would like to highlight the play sprite. And if the down arrow key is pressed, I'd like to highlight the quit sprite. Let's test this out as well. So this is how it starts up. If I press the down arrow, now you can see that the quit sprite is highlighted. If I press the up arrow, the play sprite is highlighted. Okay, so far so good. Now we want the progress bar to appear when the enter key is pressed. So let's go ahead and build that in as well. And test it out. So I can still toggle between the two options, and now I'm going to press the enter key. Oh, I understand. This is a Mac. So I'm going to now change this. Since I am using a MacBook Pro, it does not have a keypad enter key. So I'm going to change that to return. Voila. So now that this progress bar can be made visible when I press the return or the enter key, I still would want it to start off at 0 and animate all the way, or fill up all the way to 1 over a few seconds. So in order for us to do that, let's make another method that sets the value of the progress bar. And this is basically going to wrap around changing the fill amount on the fill sprite for the progress bar. So if just to jog your memory, if you look at the fill sprite, we had a fill amount which could be toggled like so. The reason you can't see it is because we're in the game view. And let's bring this forward, shall we? That is strange. So yeah, so when I slide this slider, when I change the value of the fill amount property for this UI sprite, I can then control the amount of fill on this progress bar. So let's go ahead and build a wrapper around that. And when I start my progress bar, I want the value to be 0. And when the enter key is pressed, I want this to change over the course of a few seconds. Now, I could just write something that constantly updates, or I could probably do it in a coroutine. That is really up to you. But I'm going to use a coroutine for this. And I want that coroutine to run just once. So in order to do that, I'm going to create a flag. And really, I should be checking for the same thing here. So if I press the enter key, and if the status of that flag is still false, then show me the progress bar and start the coroutine that I'm about to write here. So let's first write that coroutine. So what I want to do now is slowly change the fill value of the progress bar of the sprite using this method. And I want it to happen over a few seconds. I don't really have a harsh criterion of how long I want that to take place over. So I'm just going to go ahead and write a loop that does that. Let me also write a getter. So while the progress bar's value is less than 1, keep doing this. And just because I'm a little more particular, I'm going to create a separate method that allows me to update the value of the progress bar just by a little. Okay. So let's say I add 0.01, and then I'd want to just wait for a little while. And let's say I wait for 0.1 seconds, 100 milliseconds. And now I would like to start that coroutine. All right. So let's go ahead and test this out. So I can still toggle between these, and when I press enter, you can see that my progress bar is slowly filling up all the way from 0 to 1. So the last portion of our interaction was that once the progress bar reaches or is completely reaches 1 or is completely filled, we wanted to slowly lower the opacity of this UI and fade it out. So we already have a coroutine that's kind of changing the value of the progress bar, and this loop in that coroutine would end as soon as the progress bar is filled. So we could simply write another while loop that changes the opacity of the UI. So how do we go about changing the opacity of the UI? Let's take a look at our UI hierarchy. So we have the UI root, we have the camera, we have the anchor, and then we have the panel. And the panel actually has an alpha value which can be controlled to change the opacity of the entire UI. So let's go ahead and add another public member that will reference the panel in our UI. And now let's drag the panel and attach it to the script. Okay. So now we're just going to change the value of the alpha for this panel until, or we're going to keep changing, keep deducting it until it's reached 0. And let's say we'll do another 0.01. And this time I want to wait for a shorter period of time. I don't want it to be quite as long. So I'm going to say, yeah, let's wait for 10 milliseconds. All right, let's go ahead and check this code out. So my arrow keys work. When I press enter, the progress bar appears and starts filling up. And let's wait for that fill to get complete and see how the opacity changes. Perfect. And so we've created a user interface using NGUI's free version. We've learned how to manipulate sprites, creating first of all, we learned how to take textures, mash them up into a UI atlas, use the sprites from within the UI atlas to lay out our UI. We learned about how sprites could dynamically be changed between different states. For example, in the play, we had two states. For the play sprite, we had two states with the normal and the highlighted state. We learned how to activate those through code. We learned about simple sprites and filled sprites, and we also learned how to change the fill amount using code. And we learned how to change the opacity of the panel to fade the UI out using code. And so that was the introductory lecture on developing user interfaces with NGUI. Hopefully, this will help you make your own user interfaces for your class projects. Thank you.